Well, thank you very much for that very gracious and generous introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here at UC Irvine with all of you today. As you can see, I live and work in Denver. At the higher elevations in the foothills outside of town, we're already having some colder temperatures and some snow. When I left Denver this morning, there was a distinct wintry chill in the air. So it's great to be here in Southern California, enjoying a little bit more summer before I give into to winter. And it's certainly a pleasure to be here with my colleague, Dr. Brunstetter, and all of you students and community members who've come today. So it's really a delight to be here, and thank you so much. I am going to talk today mostly about the recent book, Outsourcing War. Towards the end of my talk, I'll touch a little bit on a project that extends some of this to look at the role that private military companies play in post-war settlements and the conditions under which peace is established as well. Okay. Going to start out by introducing this concept of private military companies and looking at the emergence of this market for private force. Then we'll move into looking at the just war tradition and how these two things relate to one another. Our current market for private force really began to emerge in the 1990s, right? Not coincidentally, this happened after the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And there are really three key dynamics that contributed to the emergence of this market for private force. There was an element of supply. Both Russia and the US cut the size of their militaries. We had additionally some other local developments happening within the international system around the same time, namely the end of apartheid in South Africa. This resulted in a glut of unemployed individuals with military skills and also weapons, both of which were very available on the open market and became very inexpensive because of this large supply that came to be available. At the same time, we had a corresponding increase in demand. With the end of the Cold War, we saw an outbreak of civil conflict in places where conflict had been contained, while the US and the Soviet Union still had influence over their client states. At the same time, states and international organizations were becoming less willing to intervene in these conflicts. So we had, in other words, some unmet demand for security services. We may ask, why turn to the private market to solve this problem, right? It's not an inevitable solution. We certainly could have solved the unmet demand in other ways. States could have rebuilt their militaries. International organizations could have played a larger, more significant role in some of these conflicts. The reason why we see states turning to the private market is at least partly because the idea of privatization was itself quite influential. We see within this market for private force and within the turn towards privatization more broadly, a faith that the private market can provide better, less expensive solutions than the public sector can. So this is an idea that was very influential and that really drove the growth in this market for private force. In terms of the growth, I want to emphasize that we're really not talking here about a phenomenon that is marginal. We're talking about a phenomenon that's quite influential in contemporary conflicts. If you look in particular at the figures in the post-Cold War conflicts from the Balkans on, we see private contractors outnumbering active duty military in these conflicts. In particular, in Afghanistan and Iraq, we see contractors outnumbering the military personnel that we had deployed in those conflicts. Another measure of the growth of this industry is the revenue that it generates. Okay? If we look back to 1990, we see the private military industry generating about $55 billion in revenue. For 2016, it's projected to be $244 billion. So that's really quite a phenomenal level of growth in a relatively short period of time. And just as a note, the revenue from the private military industry grew at approximately twice the rate of the US economy overall. Our economy grew on average at about 3%, and the private military industry was growing at about 7%. So it's really remarkable growth in terms of the industry's revenues. Another way to approach the significance of private military companies is to look at the functions that they're performing. And I'm borrowing here a metaphor that P.W. Singer used to categorize private military companies and the functions that they perform. You see here he's got a spear. The point of the spear symbolizing the front line of conflict, right? Proximity to the battle space. And he's got three categories of firms here: military provider firms, military consultant firms, and military support firms, kind of in descending order of their proximity to the battle space. I want to talk a bit about what these functions are and how they matter, why they matter. We'll start with military provider firms. These are companies that engage in the offensive use of force on behalf of their clients. As you can imagine, these companies have the potential to very dramatically alter the capabilities of their clients. They can very quickly, almost immediately, transform the strategic balance. We should note, however, that this contribution really ends as soon as the company departs, right? So their impact is significant, but it doesn't outlast typically the duration of the contract. Moving down from our point of the spear, military consultant firms provide advice and training to their clients. Right? This is really the type of service that has the greatest potential to have a lasting impact for clients. If a consultant firm can modernize and transform a client's military force, this is something that potentially has a very lasting effect on the strategic capabilities of the client who has hired this company. Last but not least, our military support firms provide logistical support. Right? They do things like guarding convoys, as you see here. They also do things like running camps for soldiers, providing meals. So they're providing logistical support that may seem to be fairly far removed from the conflict. Nevertheless, they're still important strategically as a force multiplier, in part because they're freeing up military personnel who would, prior to this market for private force, have been performing those non-combat related functions. So in a sense, by having a contractor in the kitchen, you're freeing up the soldier who would have been there. Okay. Kind of beyond P.W. Singer's spear, we also see some other functions that private military companies are increasingly engaging in. One of those is the gathering and analysis of intelligence. This is increasingly becoming a function that's performed by private actors. Beyond that, PMCs have expertise that helps to shape our thinking about issues. And if we recognize that these actors are not only military actors, they're also economic actors. Okay? They're certainly not neutral in terms of the characterization of an issue that they present. So we'll come back to this when we get into some of the thinking about the just war tradition, but suffice it to say that when we turn to private military companies for expertise, we oftentimes will get expertise that serves the interest of the industry. So with that, armed with our knowledge that private military companies are significant actors both in terms of the size of the industry and the functions that they perform, let's turn to looking at the just war tradition. We'll talk a bit about what it is, then we'll get into some specifics about some of the principles. We're talking here, of course, about an ethical tradition that applies to waging war. Okay? As a note, the just war tradition predates the emergence of the state and the state system, right? We typically pinpoint the emergence of the state system, the modern state system, around 1648, right, when the Peace of Westphalia is signed. The just war tradition made significant advances in the Middle Ages in Christian Europe, but I think we can make a case that the tradition is actually much older than that. And we see even ancient Greek philosophers making reference to the ethics of war fighting. So this is a tradition that's very old, much older than the state. Nonetheless, to the extent that the just war tradition mirrors patterns of political authority within the international system, it's a tradition that has become embedded in the state and therefore has some difficulty in accommodating non-state actors like private military companies. A subset of our just war tradition are jus ad bellum principles. These are the principles that apply to our decision to go to war. And I'm going to submit to you that they have a specific purpose, which is to limit the unjust use of force and minimize the destructive effects of war. I want to talk about a few of these principles, and then we'll think about how some of them are problematized by the emergence of the private military industry. The first one I want to talk about is the principle of authority, the concept that a just war is waged by an actor with the authority to fight that war. And we'll talk a bit more about what that means. Right? Another really significant principle is the concept of just cause. That when we're fighting a war, we're fighting for a just cause. We're not fighting for revenge or conquest or aggrandizement. We're fighting for a cause that is just within the meaning of the just war tradition. Finally, even supposing that these principles are satisfied, we also have what are called these ancillary or additional principles that also must be satisfied if we're going to characterize a war as being just. One of these is last resort. Have we at least attempted to resolve our issue with nonviolent measures, right? The nonviolent measures that are likely to resolve the problem. We don't have to literally exhaust them all, but we have to at least try some other measures that are perhaps likely to succeed, likely to help us resolve the issue that is prompting us to consider war. Additionally, does waging war have a reasonable chance of success? Is it likely that we'll be able to achieve our objective? If not, we're certainly just kind of inviting the destruction of war without achieving any kind of a just outcome. Right? Even if we can succeed, is the war proportional? Do the good effects outweigh the bad effects? Right? And finally, question of intention. What's our purpose in fighting? Right? And I'm again going to submit to you that when we're talking about intention, the proper intention for a state behaving justly to have is the reestablishment of a just peace. Okay? Let's dig into some of these a little further. We'll begin with authority, because authority is really where the private military companies pose a challenge. Right? This principle of right authority mirrors political institutions and patterns of authority. Right? over time, the meaning of this has changed. Right? In the Middle Ages, authority was very diffuse. Right? It was diffuse in the sense that political authority was based in part on personal allegiance. There was a quasi-territorial basis. What this meant is that individuals may owe duties to multiple actors simultaneously. At the same time, there may be noticeable gaps in authority. Right? During the Middle Ages, we saw the right to declare war being claimed at several points in this feudal system, right? Including some actors that we would think of as very low ranking within the system. On top of this complicated system of feudal authority, we also had the authority of the Catholic Church. Right? The Catholic Church also claimed and utilized the authority to declare war, of course, in the form of the Crusades. So what this meant is we had multiple actors who claimed the right to wage war. It was an incredibly complex system, and we'll see that in contrast to our successor system, right, the emergence of the state. With the rise of the state, authority over the use of force came to be consolidated in the state. Right? This, of course, didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen immediately when the Peace of Westphalia was signed. We can view that as being perhaps the starting point. We really don't see the state consolidating its authority over the use of force until the French Revolution, when the national military, the citizen military, really became the norm in the international system. Right? This is when we see the state beginning to consolidate its authority over the use of force. And of course, Max Weber's conception of the state as the actor claiming a monopoly over the legitimate use of force really began to become central within our discipline of political science. At this point, the question of authority is a very simple one. Is the actor a state or not? Right? We view at this point the principle of right authority as really serving to separate violence that's war, that's carried out by the state and potentially just, from violence that's carried out by non-state actors that's really per se unethical. Okay? The emergence of private military companies poses some problems for our state monopoly over the legitimate use of force. Of course, we've seen non-state actors engaging in the use of force for quite some time. If we look back to the 20th century, we see the emergence of civil war, interstate conflict, as becoming a more significant form of political violence than interstate war, war fought by state actors, between state actors. And of course, we see other types of groups engaging in the use of force as well, transnational criminal organizations, terrorist groups. What's really distinctive about private military companies, and the reason why they're problematic in terms of the state monopoly over the legitimate use of force, is this. Right? For one thing, we can't say that they're not behaving legitimately. They're behaving with the sanction of the state. They're engaging in the use of force with the sanction of the state. We therefore can't treat them as actors that are illegitimate. And I'll suggest that the sanction of the state takes a couple of forms. One of those being the consumption of private force by states, right? These actors, these private military companies, are often working for state actors. Right? Beyond that, we see states that are very important producers and consumers of private force, including the United States, setting up licensing systems for private military companies to sell their services. So we can't say as a category of actor that the private military company is not a legitimate actor, although particular companies may be deemed illegitimate and they may be denied permission to sell their services. As a category of actor, we can't say that PMCs are across the board illegitimate, right? The other issue is that private military companies operate independently of the state, right? They fall outside the chain of command. Although they may be deployed alongside state military forces, they are operating independently of those military forces. The state doesn't exert direct control over them. Right? If we view the state's monopoly over political violence as broken, which I do, this means that we have to reopen the question of political authority. It's no longer good enough to say that an actor is a non-state actor, and so by definition their use of force is unjust. Right? I think that this means we have to begin to consider the claims of non-state actors to engaging in the just use of force alongside similar claims made by states. Okay. I want to turn to talking about just cause. Right? As I told you earlier, a just war must be waged for a just cause. Okay? And in the contemporary formulation, we typically think about two types of causes as being just. One of them is self-defense. If a state is attacked, then the use of force in self-defense against that attack is going to be considered a just cause. Right? Beyond that, there are instances where severe violations of human rights may also trigger the just cause to wage war. Right? We have a kind of emerging body of literature on the responsibility to protect, where the use of force in defense of people who are victims of gross violations of human rights is also deemed to be a just cause. How does this interact with privatization? It interacts in at least a couple of ways that I want to talk about. One is that privatization continues what we think of as the alienation of war, right? The alienation of war from society as a whole. Think about it as continuing a process that perhaps began, at least in this country, with the abolition of the draft, right? We don't have a draft. There's no longer a chance that someone is going to be sent to fight in a war without volunteering for military service, right? This certainly means that we're going to perhaps consider the decision to go to war less seriously if there's not a realistic prospect that we personally are going to be fighting in that war. Likewise, we don't see war as a social endeavor any longer, right? Think back to the experience of World War II. Perhaps your grandparents or great-grandparents might have told you about their experiences during World War II, where even if they weren't in the military, they were contributing in important ways to the war effort, right? Through rationing, through contributing materials to the war effort. We can view privatization as a continuation of this dynamic of the alienation of war, right? Not only are we not going to fight ourselves unless we have volunteered to do so, right? Now we don't even necessarily have to send our state forces to fight in the war. We may be able to hire companies to carry out these functions on our behalf. To return to an earlier point, right? Here is where it really matters that private actors help to shape our perception of issues as being security problems as opposed to being some other type of problem. And just by way of example, the case I talk about in the book at some length is the problem of state failure, right? We have this concept that states whose economies or governments collapse are failed states. This concept of state failure actually came from actors within the private military industry, right? As a consequence, we don't view these problems necessarily as political, social, or economic problems. We view them as security problems, right? We don't talk about states having failed outside the context of intervening. Right? I want to turn to thinking about reasonable chance of success. I think the complications here are fairly straightforward, right? Whether we have a reasonable chance of succeeding in a war or not depends upon our estimates of the relative capabilities of each side to a conflict. The ability of states to hire private force means that capabilities can change at any time. In particular, if we're thinking about a state hiring a military provider firm, we're thinking about a state that is able to change its strength, its capabilities, very quickly, right? Quite literally, almost with the stroke of a pen. So the estimates that we make about the relative capabilities of the sides, whether we have a reasonable chance of succeeding or not, are increasingly very contingent, right? We may have a reasonable chance of success today, right? But in the future, with the availability of private force, the capabilities of our opponent may change dramatically. The final one I want to talk about is proportionality. Right? This question of the balance between harm and good. I'll suggest that privatization makes these costs more difficult to assess. I've got a graphic here showing combatants who have been killed in Iraq between 2003 and 2015. The dark blue section is actually US contractors. Right? And as we see, they've been killed in almost the same numbers as military forces, right? Which is not surprising given the fact that they were deployed there in greater numbers than our military personnel were. Right? Nevertheless, deaths among contractors were not counted among official U.S. casualty figures. The Department of Defense, as they would give casualty figures, weren't talking about contractors. They were only talking about active duty military personnel. We actually did have a federal agency that was tracking deaths among contractors, but it wasn't the Department of Defense. It was the Department of Labor. Right? So when we were getting a picture of what the war was costing in terms of human life, it was a picture that was very incomplete. Right? Very difficult then to make an assessment about the balance between harm and good. Right? So what do we do? I want to talk here about our principles of jus ad bellum as they apply to privatized war. Right? Private military companies act in concert with the actors who hire them, the states that hire them. I propose in the book that the only reasonable way to really treat this is to attribute the capabilities, actions, and losses among private military companies to the actor that's hired them. Treating private military companies and states as in practical terms, a single entity promotes the goals of our jus ad bellum principles, which you'll recall I was arguing included the limiting of the destructive effects of war and the restraint of unjust use of force. However, the fluid nature of private force may mean that we don't make these determinations on a once and for all basis any longer. Right? We may need to look at these as ongoing questions that we reevaluate at different points in time as the reality of on the ground changes, right? As capabilities change, as costs change. Right? I want to turn now to another project that I've been working on as an outgrowth of the Outsourcing War book. And that's looking at privatization and just peace. Right? You'll recall that I advanced the proposition that if we're thinking about the intent of actors, the purpose of a just war is the establishment of a just peace. Right? I think we can take this in a couple of ways. Right? Drawing on the work of Johan Galtung, I'm going to propose a couple of dimensions to this. One is a negative peace dimension, where we view peace as being the absence of fighting. Right? We view peace as being the absence of fighting. The other is a positive peace dimension, right? Where we view peace as entailing not just the absence of violence, but the presence of things like justice, equality, economic growth, social cooperation, right? And I think that a just peace really needs to have both of these dimensions. So the question is whether private military companies aid in achieving this just peace. Right? There's a body of research that suggests that private military companies can actually bring fighting to an end more rapidly by virtue of their involvement in conflict, at least in certain circumstances. And I've included here a reference to an article that tests this in the context of African civil conflicts in the 1990s. And what they found is that this is the case in a couple of circumstances. One is where the private military company has received natural resource concessions as payment for their services, right? Where the private military company is paid at least partly in terms of the right to extract natural resources. The second condition is the presence of multiple private military companies in the conflict, which the authors of the piece have cited here. Infer means that there's competition among the companies, right? Where there are multiple companies, we can make the inference, they argue, that the companies are competing with one another to deliver a better service. In other words, a quicker end to the conflict. Right? But I think we need to ask the question of whether the peace is actually just, right? There are a couple ways we can talk about this. This quantitative part actually comes out of some work that I've been doing with Bojana Welborn from Smith. We'll talk about what this means, but we've run a couple of models to test what peace looks like after it's attained. There's reference here to model 1, which is a survival model. How long does the peace last? All right. And our second model is a hazard model. What's the hazard of war after a peace accord has been reached? And we have some pretty interesting findings here. There's a negative relationship between private military companies and both of these models, right? So where multiple private military companies are present in these conflicts, two things happen. The duration of the post-peace accord peace becomes shorter. And the hazard of renewed fighting goes up, right? There's an increased hazard of renewed fighting after the peace accord has been signed. Interestingly, you may notice there's a similar dynamic for the presence of United Nations peacekeepers. So where peacekeepers are involved in the conflict, we see by and large the same things happening, right? We see duration of peace becoming shorter and hazard of renewed fighting increasing. Right? So in terms of negative peace, in terms of our negative peace measure, the question of does the peace last, these results suggest that it doesn't last longer as a result of the involvement of private military companies. Let's ask our positive peace question. What does the presence of private military companies mean for some of the rights that we associate with positive peace, right? Including the right to physical integrity, right? Women's rights, we looked at women's rights in particular because they are often one of the more vulnerable groups that are victimized by armed conflict, right? We also looked at governmental stability and we looked at socioeconomic stability. Our statistically significant results were the negative relationships between physical integrity rights and socioeconomic stability, right? Which again suggests that private military companies aren't necessarily improving life for the people who've been victimized by the conflicts in these countries that we were looking at, right? So to return to this question of private military companies and a just peace, our findings suggest that peace may be obtained more quickly, but it's less likely to last, right? Additionally, privatization does not achieve the goods that we associate with a positive peace. Given the results that we saw also with peacekeepers, what this suggests is that achievement of a just peace may not necessarily result when outsiders become involved in conflicts, right? When they play a key role in resolving the conflict, the result may not be a peace that's lasting or a peace that secures significant goods for the people living within those countries. I think this suggests that we can certainly obtain a settlement, right, a peace accord, but we don't necessarily obtain the results that we want from that. So in the end, right, we see private military companies certainly posing complications for a number of dimensions of these jus ad bellum principles that we're looking at. In the end, I argue that the just war tradition, because it's not inherently tied to the state, is something that I think can adapt to this. It can certainly remain relevant. We can take account of the role of these non-state actors, and indeed, given the increasing significance of non-state actors, including private military companies in conflict, it's really essential that we do so. So I want to thank you. I've got some contact information here. Thank you.